For the past 3 years, I don't think anything on the internet has been quite as consistently inescapable as Genshin Impact has. Well, to me, anyway. I had downloaded and played the game a little bit when it was released, and ended up dropping it shortly after, but that had done absolutely nothing to affect my overall exposure to it, because this thing was everywhere. So while at the time, I didn't know too much about the game in detail, I did know that there were 3 character designs in particular I really, really liked. Sucrose, Razor, and Scaramouche. Fast forward to summer of 2022 when I was in the mood for something nice and long to accompany me on these giant walks I was taking. My brain, ever a wealth of brilliant ideas, went, hey, what if you just watch nearly 40 hours of Genshin Impact lore? Not to, start playing the game or anything. For fun. So I did, and somehow the game just suddenly appeared downloaded on my phone at the end of it. Weird. But hey, it's fine. This means I can finally start playing as my first favorite characters from way back when the game first came out. Sucrose, Razor, and he's not. He's still not in the game yet? Well, is he going to be? Okay, fine. Yeah, at least I got Sucrose and Xingqiu, so I guess I can wait. He better be worth it though, or... There's something so fascinating about Scaramouche as a character. His story is, in my opinion, one of the most compelling, well-developed, and well-executed in the entire game, and 3.3 really just solidified all of that for me. In my opinion, it's one of the best quests Genshin has ever put out, and since I am in the extreme minority of people who wasn't a super big fan of 4.2 for a few different reasons, this still rings true to me even now. Which, considering how his only appearance in the game for a year and a half was widely considered to be one of the largest examples of Genshin's less than stellar approaches to certain aspects of their storytelling, is kind of funny. We truly have come a long way. Thank God. In case you didn't know, and if you don't, I honestly wouldn't blame you, Scaramouche's very first appearance in the game was way back in version 1.1, during the Unreconciled Stars event. He shows up, tries to kill us, and ceremoniously announces that the sky and everything in it is fake, and then dips. Okay. His second appearance, all the way in 2.1, is even shorter, where we only get about 3 minutes or so with him in the Delusion factory. The conversation here mainly stays focused on the Fatui and their plans, not so much on Scaramouche himself. Oh, and he tries to kill us again, of course. As he does. Now, even including the time-limited Unreconciled Stars event, this really is not a lot of content. But despite that, Scaramouche's distinctly colorful personality still manages to be fully on display here, and that, coupled with his established status as a harbinger and his design, how can you not love the giant hat, managed to make a lot of people immediately interested in him as a character. Now, I want to establish right off the bat that this video is not in any way going to focus on analysis from a meta perspective. If that's your thing, that's great, but I'm only going to be looking at story and quest content, because that's kind of the only thing I care about. Sorry. So if really in-depth examinations of the psychology of a 2D, angsty, functionally immortal theater kid aren't your thing, this video might not be for you, and that's okay. But for someone like me, who essentially only looks at story and personality when deciding whether I'm going to be fully interested in a character or not, both of these things need to be good. And I think we can pretty safely assume what my ultimate stance on Scaramouche is. But why, What is it about this one guy that makes him so interesting and compelling to so many people, including myself? Well, one of the biggest contributors to this ridiculously large Scaramouche thoughts section of my brain was the Husk of Opulent Dreams artifact set, or really the text associated with it. For those who don't know, because I didn't when I started playing this game and had no idea where people were pulling all of this obscure information from, every artifact set in Genshin has a small paragraph of text accompanying it, detailing the lore surrounding that specific piece's history within the game's narrative. In the Hood set's case, the pieces within it all once belonged to Scaramouche, and the text attached to them details essentially his entire character arc, so from being created by A until his ultimate transformation into Shouki no Kami, with a bit more detail on his broader time spent in Tatarasuna than was shown in 3.3, which was more about the furnace incident specifically. Before his story teasers and all that started coming out, this was all we really had in terms of a look into Scaramouche's character in detail. Well, that and a good old classic helping of Yaimiku exposition. My favorite. Despite that, though, these few short paragraphs of text manage to do a lot with so little. It paints a really interesting picture about where Scaramouche started from and where he's been, and leaves the matter of where he'll be going open-ended. Mostly. But we'll get to that. With Inversion of Genesis, though, came the final nail on the head to really cement my position of Scaramouche being one of the best written characters in this game, because this quest is fantastic. The main reason I love this quest so much can actually be found within my favorite piece of the hood set, which is the flower. Not only has it got this one section that essentially implies that Scaramouche experienced a singular human emotion and immediately blamed it on Dottore, but there's also this really great part that comes immediately after. You once acquired the heart that you always dreamed of, but it was but a mere prop for lies and deception. Now you will finally obtain what belongs to you. Was it a him from the past who said this, or him from the future? The vagrant cared not, for when he awakened, it was not he, but that ethereal future that dissipated. I love this bit because it manages to encapsulate the entire point that 3.3 was trying to get at in just a few lines. Hints of this theme are present throughout the rest of the set too, especially with its continued use of repetition. This right here is what got Scaramouche his vision. And to help illustrate why, I only need to pose one question, because it's also the question that Scaramouche had to pose to himself. Who is this section actually referring to?
It took 3 betrayals for me to finally understand. The world is just an elaborate tapestry of lies.
Genshin is no stranger to characters going by multiple different names, and the anemo element itself is no stranger to struggles related to personal identity, but Scaramouche is sort of the very sad and angsty exacerbation of both of these concepts smushed together and taken to their highest possible extremes. Pre-3.3 Scaramouche had gone through a number of identities throughout the course of his life, but understanding each of them is instrumental in understanding how we reach the character he becomes in 3.3, so I think it's well worth diving into each of them in depth. We'll make a little timeline. First, there's just the puppet, a kind of blank slate, freshly out of creation by the Electro Archon. I'm sure we all know the story by now. He was intended to be the vessel for her gnosis, but when she observed him crying in his dreams, she deemed him unfit for the sort of position demanded of the Raiden Shogun, and left him to sleep in Shouki Pavilion. Now, it's a little unclear, but I want to posit that I don't think Scaramouche ever actually met A while she was working on him. I think he was asleep the whole time. If he was aware of anything, it was probably in a very new robot state, if you know what I mean. The game hasn't shown anything to me that would indicate him having ever actually interacted with her during this period, especially with all the emphasis 3.3 put on Shouki Pavilion specifically as being his birthplace. So essentially, his very first memory is waking up alone, much like someone else we know, but we'll come back to that. An indeterminate amount of time later, he's discovered by Katsuragi, who in the hood set notices this golden feather A left with him and identifies him as a creation of the Shogun. But in 3.3, I think this is simplified to just noticing he has fine clothes. This feather in particular has, ironically, a lot of weight attached to it, which is why I'm a bit disappointed to see it left out of the Archon quest aside from one singular mention, but it's a broader telling of the story, so I get it. This early, newly made puppet era, where he's first forming his impressions of the world, kind of bleeds into the start of Identity 2, the Kabuki Mono. This is the title given to him by essentially the workers of the Tadasuna once Katsuragi took him out of the pavilion, since at this point Katsuragi and Nagamasa, his superior, were the only 2 people who knew the truth of where he'd come from. To everyone else, this was just some weird guy they'd found walking out on the beach. I do want to highlight one particular moment, though.
Well, we need to call you something. I hear the workers are calling you the Kabuki Mono.
That's fine with me.
Again, Scaramouche's story is all about identity, but with him in particular, it quickly becomes apparent that he spent the vast majority of his life letting himself be defined by titles other people have given him. The puppet, the Kabuki Mono, the balladeer, Shouki no Kami, even kunikuzushi, a name Scaramouche picked for himself and as such I think was consequently left out of the 3.3 quest, was itself an Inazuman character archetype whose traits he wanted to embody at the time, so it isn't even something he made for himself. None of these are names, they're titles with specific actions and characteristics assigned to them he's expected to fill. With this in mind, the theater references sprinkled all throughout his character and story make a lot of sense. These are all just various different parts he's been playing. Now, this is where another one of my criticisms of 3.3 comes from, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Just something to keep in mind. Moving back to our Kabukimono, he unfortunately isn't doing too great, as the little family he thought he built for himself was orchestrated into falling apart at the hands of Dottore, though he isn't quite aware of that last part yet. Made to believe that, as a creation of the shogun, this is the role he must play, he's tricked into entering the furnace and taking the full brunt of all of its power while unknowingly holding the literal heart of Niwa, the man who had considered him just as human as anyone else. Once he sees what's inside, the doctor lies to him, saying that the heart instead belonged to a random man Niwa had murdered in cold blood. So, the puppet had finally attained that heart. It was, after all, his purpose for being, the very reason he existed. Yet it was not what the puppet truly desired, for it did not contain any blessings, but was instead a sacrifice, brimming with selfishness, hypocrisy, cunning, and curses, all wrapped in an amiable husk. After his relationship with the workers fell through, Scaramouche met and grew close with a young child, an orphan of a craftsman from the Tadasuna. Though the child was sick, they'd promised that Scaramouche could stay and live and grow together with them, and that they could be a real family to each other. Unfortunately, that's not quite how things turned out. Now, I see a lot of people look at this and go, wow, Scaramouche, you're really gonna accuse a child of betraying you because they died of their own horrible terminal illness? And on paper, yes, that is technically what his reaction was. There's a bit more going on here than that. Scaramouche is someone that consistently relies on external validation. He needs someone or something outside of him to give him the things he doesn't believe himself capable of entirely having on his own. So, hence his constant search for a heart, but this also manifests in other areas of his life. Again, every identity he's ever strived to take on has been one already laid out for him by someone else. So, I believe this child he befriended also served as a sort of test for him, a way for him to confirm that despite his lack of a heart, despite all the things he's been taken to believing make him the furthest thing from a real human, he can still be allowed to have things, to have a life, a family, someone who truly cares about him. Because if this child that's also been through so much and is so different from everyone else around them can do it, then maybe he can too. They're so similar to each other after all. Only they aren't similar. The child is human and mortal, and Scaramouche is not. And he's uncomfortably reminded of that when he returns one day to find them dead. The promise he'd had with his friend is actually multiple different promises squished together into one. First, there was the actual verbal promise they'd made, that they'd get to stay and be a family together. Then there were all of the hidden promises Scaramouche had been trying to confirm for himself, that the child was sort of serving as a representation of. There's the one I mentioned earlier, but another one is really well illustrated in his character teaser. The child is telling him the story with the little nutcracker toy that promises he's actually had the heart he'd been wanting deep down all along. And Scaramouche sort of dismisses this. He goes, oh, well, it was only ashes in the shape of a heart, not a real one. And when the child dies, his worst fears are confirmed. That heart of the nutcrackers really had just been ashes, and he'd never truly had one after all. Because if he did, this cannot possibly be what having this heart he's been craving so much is really like. So the puppet had finally attained that heart. It was, after all, his purpose for being, the very reason he existed. Yet it was not what the puppet truly desired, for it did not contain any blessings, but was instead a sacrifice, brimming with selfishness, hypocrisy, cunning, and curses, all wrapped in an amiable husk. And this brings us to nebulous fatui time. Since most of these people are functionally immortal, it can be difficult to pinpoint just how long certain events are taking place for, but we know from Wanderer's character stories that it would be decades before he officially takes up the mantle of the Sixth Harbinger, so we aren't quite at the balladeer just yet. This is obviously a very long amount of time, so while it'd be impossible to really be told about every single specific thing that happened during this period, I still think it's worth looking at what the sort of general atmosphere around Scaramouche was at the time, and how it may have influenced or affected him. It's mentioned in his character stories that the balladeer was a name he felt like he could win, a title that once he successfully received it would confirm his true strength and power. Again, he's turning to people and things outside of himself to verify pieces of his own identity. So he's still letting other people tell him what he is, but because he had to work for this particular title, I think that really made it feel like it was his, which is probably exactly what the Fatui wanted him to think. Unfortunately. We know that they'd had plans for Scaramouche long before he'd ever even agreed to join up with them, so even though a chunk of this time was spent unlocking his powers and such, they were going to keep him around regardless. It was always more about the mindset they needed to get him in. Scaramouche is not the sort of person that can just be ordered into doing something, so everything is done with the intention of making him feel like he's choosing a better, stronger path for himself, despite all the pain and torture brought along with it. Look at what are likely some of, if not the first words Pierrot ever says to him. What you are, truly, is a weapon, one that could be wielded with an iron will. Or you could continue to drift aimlessly. Dottore needs to experiment on him endlessly, but it's all for the purposes of furthering his big, grand research project that Scaramouche specifically gets to be a part of. He can take far more abuse and pain than any real human could, so doesn't that mean he was practically made to be doing this? The true extent of his powers have even been unlocked, so now his worth and utility as a puppet, as a tool to be used, can be fully realized. And they tell him that directly. They enforce this mindset and idea that he is nothing more than a tool to be used, but because of the way it's executed, Scara fully embraces and accepts this under the guise of it being something that makes him better and stronger than everyone else. He's not like those weak little humans with their pathetic feelings. He's getting manipulated into willingly signing up to become a literal cog in a machine created by the man who tortured him for decades. So, take that. This is gross and sad, but it unfortunately does work, and we can see in his character story how he begins to adopt and accept this idea that he is inhumane. The other Fatui only ever refer to him as a puppet, and even once he becomes a harbinger, this kind of stays. He's put on standby, like a doll, poised and ready at all times to be taken out whenever it's needed. With how he's clearly very willing to just take the Gnosis and run at the end of the 2.1 quest, he likely wasn't too satisfied with this arrangement. But the Fatui, or rather, Dottore, don't seem particularly shaken or phased. After all, if it's greater power he wants, then that'll certainly be something he can get. Before we start heading off into all of that, though, we need to talk about kunikuzushi.
Never been born at all. Is that really all you wish for?
I'm putting this section here mostly because it's a bit unclear where this era takes place time-wise. I don't think it's ever been confirmed if this all happened before or after he'd officially become the balladeer, though my money is personally on the former. I don't think he'd come up with a name to give himself so soon after he'd just gone through essentially hell to earn his current one. But kunikuzushi is one of my favorite Scaramouche personas. Not really because of anything plot-related particularly, but because the fact that he picked the name Destroyer of Countries for himself makes this read like his edgy MySpace screen name era, and it's all just delightfully peak angsty theater kid. Despite how vague the timing of all of this is, I do think we can confidently say that kunikuzushi came after he'd started talking with the Fatui. They're involved in his takedown of the Raiden Gokuden, there's this line from his character story, and then so if he did come up with this persona after he'd started talking with them, I think that that could be an interesting angle to examine. Now, I'm not trying to pin all of his actions on Dottore or the Fatui. Scaramouche's decisions here are still his, but I wonder if this more destructive, vengeful angle he took was something goaded on or encouraged by Dottore. With how they were trying to push this mindset of you are above all of these pitiful humans because you are a weapon destined for incredible destruction onto him, I wouldn't be surprised if kunikuzushi was kind of his first early reaction or emulation of that, even if it wasn't something directly orchestrated by Dottore. A beta balladeer, if you will. But the best thing about this kunikuzushi persona is that at the end of the day, that's all it is. A persona. Scara goes down there, guns blazing, all ready to really show it to good old Mother Dearest and mess up all their sword schools, but he doesn't actually go through with all of it, because a relative of a man he cared about ends up being there, and he doesn't want to kill him. One of the only mentions of kunikuzushi from Scaramouche's perspective we get, and we'll get to that other one later, trust me, is this singular paragraph in the hood set. The Wanderer would never admit to this. He would never admit that he had done this as an act of revenge against the bladesmith, nor would he ever mention the truth, that he had abandoned his schemes halfway because they had suddenly become dull. He would only say, in that tone of voice he had learned from a certain researcher, it was all just a little experiment into human nature. I love this section because along with giving you the sense that he's sort of embarrassed by this period of time, or at the very least doesn't really want to acknowledge it, it shows you just how little he's actually willing to admit to himself about his own feelings in his own head. The truth here isn't even the actual truth. It's just as far as he'll let himself acknowledge, because anything further would require levels of introspection and processing of emotions anemo characters seem to have a chronic allergy to. Because no, Scara, you did not stop your attack on the Raiden Gokuden because it had grown dull. You stopped because you had felt legitimate empathy for a person related to someone you used to care about. the horror. He doesn't just find the fact that he'd abandoned his scheme embarrassing, he also finds the fact that he'd even started it embarrassing. Because admitting that he'd wanted to commit revenge against someone also carries with it the admittance that he'd at one point cared about them enough to feel the strong level of hurt and betrayal fueling that revenge in the first place. He denounces the world and laughs in its face, right? Because pretending he doesn't care is easier than acknowledging how the ways he's been hurt are affecting him. It was all always worthless anyway, so none of it even mattered. It's like he's worked himself into a sort of paradox. Scaramouche is looking for a heart because he believes it will give him this last final piece he's been missing all his life. When he gets that heart he's been wanting, then he'll be complete. He'll be better. He'll be fixed. But the real kicker is that I think we can all say with complete certainty that he definitely does have a heart. He is capable of feeling a wide number of very human emotions for a wide number of people, and I think a part of him deep down is aware of this too. It's just that acknowledging those feelings means acknowledging that he really has had this thing he's been chasing after his whole life. And that can't be true because he hates the person he's been his entire life. All these identities he's had were pathetic, and getting that heart is supposed to be the one thing that will finally fix him. But if he has always truly had a heart, then what else can he do? So, in order to avoid having to deal with any of that, if he's presented with what he believes will finally be the actual heart he's always wanted, you bet he's going to go after it with everything he's got. Because if he doesn't have a heart, then all he's left with is himself. And with that, I think it's finally time to talk about Shouki no Kami.
The existence of what once called itself kunikuzushi appears infinitely small and ugly.
Scaramouche has gone through a number of identities over his lifetime, as we've established, but none are nearly as final as Shouki no Kami, with ones like the Balladeer committing himself to the persona fully left him with essentially an even worse perception of the world and his place within it. But with Shouki no Kami, there is no going back. It leaves no room for sudden empathy or feelings of hurt and betrayal. All of those things that Scaramouche desperately wishes to rid himself of. So he's perfectly aware of what agreeing to become Shouki no Kami will do to him, and we can see him regurgitate that exact rhetoric the Fatui were attempting to impress on him, and the tactic Dottore used to get him to enter the furnace back into Tadasuna that I spoke about earlier. He's different from everyone else because he was born and made to be a powerful weapon, and nothing else outside of that has ever actually mattered. You just don't get it. Getting concerned about him like your friends is ridiculous because he isn't even a person. He's supposed to go and willingly obliterate his entire body at the request of the man who tortured him for decades. Idiot. We'll come back to this again, but just keep in mind that Scaramouche's level of hatred for himself is so strong that he cannot stand the idea of continuing to exist and live on in the way he currently does. The choice he's making here to become Shouki no Kami and the choice he makes later in Irminsul are both fueled by this. And it sounds bad, but it isn't even really hatred fueled from a place of guilt, necessarily. It's this innate feeling of being broken and incomplete that he only grows more and more desperate to have fixed the longer he lives without any part of himself changing. Well, that's because he has to be the one to change himself, but he hasn't quite figured that part out yet. Look, he literally puts I in quotes. When I say his life can be separated into all these personas, I really do mean that, because he's the one that does it the most. Every start to a new era of his life is spurred on by his hatred of and desire to never continue on as the one that came before it. You can see him do this in his character story as well. The puppet was a discarded milksop, the Kabukimono unaccomplished and sheltered, and Scaramouche was a schemer, one who eventually went against divine decree, seeking to go against the tides of the world. It's like he says once you finally meet him in the workshop, this is his birth. Screw the Balladeer, he's nothing compared to who Shouki no Kami will be. What once called itself kunikuzushi appears infinitely small and ugly. Once he gets hooked up in there, we can immediately see him assume the demeanor of and start talking like this god that has existed for eons, when even the Traveler was like, dude, that's just Scaramouche with a suit on. But it's all about the role to him. He will become whatever he needs to, if it means no longer being himself. And it's this mindset, this desire and desperation to be absolutely anything except for who he is, that leads us to this.
Wait! Please! Anything but the gnosis!
This animation here is just incredible. I mean, look at the expression on his face. After so many years, he's finally gotten the one thing that can really legitimately fix him. And like he says, he can't go back to the worthless, ugly thing he'd been before. He would willingly destroy himself over surrendering to that. It's a really, really great scene. But even more telling than all the emotions present on Scaramouche's face, I think, are the ones you can see on Nahida's. And now that Scaramouche is out of commission for a bit, I'd like to take a little time to talk about Nahida and her reaction to all of this, because I think the whole situation hits a lot closer to home for her than some people might first assume.
Oh, right. It started from the moment I was born.
Nahida and Scaramouche's relationship is one of my favorite parts of this game, for a number of reasons. First, I mean, he's my favorite character and I'm a sucker for found family tropes, so of course I was going to love this, but also because of how much of his arc and struggles I think she's actually able to empathize with and relate to. Because Nahida gets it. Look at her face here. She knows what all of this means to Scara and what she's inadvertently doing to him by taking it away. And sure, the argument could be made that Nahida is just a nice person who doesn't relish in seeing other people hurt, but while that is true, it goes a bit deeper than that. I alluded to this a bit earlier, but Nahida's story, at this point at least, started almost exactly the same way Scaramouche's did. They both had an original purpose and duty they were meant to be carrying out, but their expected efficiency at actually executing it was decided for them before they'd even gotten the chance to try. And so, they both wake up alone. And in a situation like that, it's really hard to not place the cause of everything on yourself. That clearly something must be intrinsically wrong with you. And if you can just find something, one single thing that can give you the thing you think you must be missing, then you'll finally be fixed. The problem was never with you just didn't have what you needed yet. For Scaramouche, obviously, this is the gnosis, or really just a heart. For Nahida, however, this thing is Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, or the impossible standards she feels have been left behind in her wake, these seemingly insurmountable shoes she's trying to fill. If she can just catch up to her, then she'll finally be a real worthy Archon, much like how, once Scaramouche gets his heart, he'll finally be a real worthy person. There's one big problem with this way of thinking, though, and I think these two exemplify it perfectly. An idea I really subscribe to is the notion that nothing can truly give you what you have not first given to yourself. This is why we can still feel incredibly lonely even when we're surrounded by people, or feel completely content and at peace even if we're alone. If you're desperately chasing after the one perfect thing that will finally grant you something you haven't even stopped and allowed yourself to feel deserving of, then chasing is all you'll ever be doing. Nothing was ever going to be able to give Scaramouche the heart he'd always been craving because he hated himself so much that nothing was ever going to feel good enough. He kept pouring himself into these outside solutions that got larger and larger but would only still ever leave him as the same person he'd always been. If Nahida is putting all of her energy into studying in an effort to make herself feel worthy of being Rukkhadevata's successor, then her work will never be done because she hasn't allowed herself to feel like she is worthy in the first place. You know, it's funny that so much of Sumeru's plotline centers around a passage of time disguised as a time loop because two of its most important characters are essentially sticking themselves in an eternal loop disguised as the passage of time. And while Nahida comes to realize this over the course of 3.2's Archon quest with the help of the Traveler, Scaramouche isn't quite there yet, and I believe that has to do with the nature of each of their personal realizations about the subject, because they kind of go in opposite directions. Nahida loves Rukkhadevata and really looks up to and respects her, so of course the revelation that she's been a part of her all along and that all she's ever needed to do is turn within herself for the answer she's been looking for is going to feel nice and reassuring, like a warm hug. On Scaramouche's end, though, it's a lot harder to come to terms with the fact that all these people you've come to resent and despise have only ever just been you. Over and over and over again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The main point is, these two are two sides of the same coin. I think that's part of why Nahida's able to read him so well, and I don't think that any of that necessarily got erased after Rukkhadevata removed herself. Because, as the game will soon make very apparent to us, fate is not something that can be so easily changed. And with that, a whole 8,000 words later, we finally arrived at the thing that really spurred me into wanting to make this sort of video in the first place. Version 3.3's Interlude quest. Inversion of Genesis.
From this day forth, Balladeer and Kabukimono will cease to exist.
Inversion of Genesis is good. Like, really good. I'll never quite understand why people were upset about him not getting his own story quest when the Interlude Archon quests have consistently delivered some of the best and most impactful character moments in the entire game, and this one is no exception. So I just want to make one thing abundantly clear right out of the gate. I firmly believe that Scaramouche getting erased from Irminsul is one of the best ways the story could have gone in terms of facilitating the kind of growth and development he needs to really better himself and move forward with his life. Now, from a character standpoint, do I like that this is a thing that he canonically did to himself? No. Are there potentially interesting things we'll now definitely never get to see because of this? Sure. But I think people are letting what they may have really wanted to see happen cloud their judgment of what would actually make more sense for the overall narrative, as well as wildly misconstruing what this decision actually is and what it means for the game as a whole. Because let's just get one thing out of the way right off the bat. Scaramouche choosing to erase himself from Irminsul is him choosing to take his own life. That's what this was, that's what his intentions were, and there's really no getting around it. His fifth character story makes this even more explicitly clear. Now, these hands grasped at the tiniest possibility, twisting the truth to fulfill his wish. Yes, embrace it. Embrace it with this form that shall be obliterated. To ruin with this life, as worthless as flowers and feathers in the dawn dew. Farewell, world. The future shall be what it will. Farewell, nonetheless. So I really dislike the notion a lot of people have of this moment being Scaramouche wanting to escape the consequences of his actions or take the easy way out, both because it's a common accusation unfairly lauded towards actual victims and because it's just really not what's going on here. We've already established that Scaramouche is not the biggest fan of himself, to put it lightly. He dislikes who he is to the extent that he would willingly permanently twist himself into becoming something he'd gone on record for centuries saying he despises, just to avoid having to continue on being himself any longer. But now that he's lost the Gnosis, all he's been left with is himself. And again, unlike Nahida, this is not exactly a very comforting notion to sit with, because Nahida is a consciously good person, and he's... you know. So, at the start of 3.3, we see a Scaramouche that doesn't quite know what to do with himself, I think. He's reverting back to what he's always historically done, which is finding ways to be useful and just do whatever he thinks Nahida is looking to get from him. He's looking for that next role he can fill. Scaramouche is someone that bases his worth and identity entirely around his perceived utility, and I know this both because he's an anemo character and like 90% of them do exactly the same thing, and because he flat out says it multiple times throughout this quest. Here, though, we can see him admit that after the colossal failure of Shouki no Kami, even he's struggling to find an avenue someone like him could possibly be able to pursue that would sufficiently justify his existence to anyone at this point. And if his right to exist is intrinsically tied to how well he maintains whatever identity or role is expected of him, then, well, I think it's pretty clear where his mind would be going. But Nahida's clearly keeping him around for some ulterior reason, so he'll take what he can get. She wants him to go poke around Irminsul? Fine. It'll let him stick around, at least. Like a less painful version of the Abyss explorations he was sent on. Whatever. And Nahida does have some ulterior motives, just not the ones he's probably thinking of. Seeing the truth and full extent of Dotori's manipulations throughout his life was kind of the nail in the coffin for Scaramouche, the straw that broke the camel's back, and other Nahida-preferred phrases. I've talked about Dotori and his impact on Scaramouche a bit already, but I think Scara had been seeing him as a necessary evil of sorts. There's the whole, you were made to be a weapon, and no one else would be able to withstand this amount of torture like you can, so consider yourself special and lucky mentality I mentioned earlier that was being pushed onto him. But what I think also carried him through a good chunk of those years was feeling like all of this pain was at least leading somewhere in the end. He'll get a heart out of all of this. Let the bastard do what he wants. Because Scaramouche is under no illusions of Dottore being a nice guy. This isn't that sort of dynamic at all. He is well aware that this dude sucks, but he's willing to resign himself to whatever he has to for the sake of his ultimate goal. He's using him as a means to an end, essentially. And he knows that Dottore is using him as well. He just wasn't aware for quite how long. And then we get the Shouki no Kami, and in the aftermath, Scar now has to come to terms with the fact that not only has he lost what was essentially his last final resort to get what he wanted, but this thing that he'd been put through years and years of torture for the sake of was just as hollow and meaningless as everything else he's ever tried. It'd be a hard thing for anyone to process, much less someone who's convinced himself he doesn't actually feel any emotion at all. And then comes Irminsul and the revelation about Tatarasuna, and now he's realizing that he's unknowingly let this man he despises completely orchestrate and manipulate the entire trajectory of his life for decades. So that really just twists the knife in even further. It's like he says in his character story. So what was the point of all this then? Of any of it? I want to again stress that I do not believe what follows is Scaramouche trying to escape or get away with his past actions. As he says here, he could not care less about what happens to him because he views his existence up to this point as having been completely worthless and hates every version of himself he's ever tried to be. He got rid of himself once before, he can just as easily do it again, and what comes after doesn't matter because nothing ever has. The only thing he wants for himself is to no longer exist. Irminsul provides him with what he thinks is the perfect opportunity, in a sense. Not only does he get to completely obliterate his entire existence, which is the main goal, I guess, but he could also potentially help the people he cares about live the lives they deserve to have. The ones because again, much like Nahida, he always views himself as solely the problem, ruined any chances of them ever having the second they met. It's a nice bonus. A way to at least make himself useful, if nothing else. No one else would be able to do anything about this. And so, he takes the plunge.
Unfortunately, the fate of Teyvat cannot easily be changed.
When people talk about 3.3, the decision Scaramouche makes in Irminsul is what they tend to zero in and focus on the most. And, for good reason. It's a massive decision that holds giant repercussions for the story thus far and potentially moving forward. Or does it? A main problem a lot of people had with 3.3 was that they wanted their Scaramouche apology tour featuring the Raiden Shogun, Kairihara Kazuha, and dinner with child, probably. And in fanon, that's all well and good. I will be the first person to say to just have fun and do whatever you want over there. But in the narrative, after I've just spent an obscene amount of time discussing how repeatedly chasing after things outside of himself in the hopes that they'll change or fix him is what got Scaramouche into this whole mess in the first place, do you see why having his arc be resolved by doing what is essentially exactly the same thing might not be the best way for the story to go? I get it, I really do, but let's take Raiden, for example. If a conversation with her was meant to serve as the culmination of Scaramouche's arc, what legitimately could she possibly say that would feel satisfying enough to both the player and Scaramouche himself? This one simple action she took and likely didn't think much of afterwards was the foundational cause of Scaramouche's deepest insecurities that would follow him for the rest of his life. The discrepancy between how much each of these people were impacted by this event is huge. It's a very hard gap to bridge in terms of Scaramouche feeling like Raiden truly understands what she'd inadvertently done to him. He can't and shouldn't be relying on her for his emotional catharsis because I genuinely don't think she'd ever fully be able to give it to him. And that's not a dig against Raiden, it's just kind of the way the situation is. But if you're someone mourning the loss of just the potential dynamic between the two of them, then I have great news for you, because I firmly believe that nothing about it has actually changed. If Scaramouche were to go confront his mother right now, he would be meeting a woman that does not know him. She has no conception of the true impact she's had on his life, because to her, she just made a few Shogun prototypes, discarded what she didn't need, and went on dealing with the mountain of other things she had going on in her life. How is that any different than what it was before? It's the same thing with Kazuha too, just in reverse. If Scaramouche went up to Kazuha, confessed to being behind the fall of the Raiden Gokuden, and then turned around and went, "See, traveler? Now I've redeemed myself," you would all call bullshit, wouldn't you? Because that would be completely skipping over all of the work needed to be done internally. I've said it once, I'll say it a million times. Solely relying on other people or things to redeem or fix you will never actually give you either of those outcomes. You need to be the source of those things for yourself. Also, Kazuha was not alive when the fall of the Raiden Gokuden happened. He did not physically see any of these events as they were happening, so all he has to go off of is what he's been told. The Gokuden was still destroyed as an act of revenge by someone angered by the Shogun's indifference. Just, the subject of it was slightly changed. If a post 3.3 Scaramouche were to walk up to Kazuha and sincerely tell him, I was the one really behind the incident that led to the complete destruction of your clan, I think
Kazuha
would have reason to believe him. He showed himself to be a good judge of character after all, so he'd likely be able to get the sense that Scaramouche was being genuine in his confession. And again, this confession would look largely the same as it would have before. I am a decades-old puppet created by the Shogun, so I was alive during the time of the Raiden Gokuden, and am responsible for its destruction. That would have all been said regardless. The only one I will concede on something legitimately being lost is with Child, but again, I feel that people are letting what they've imagined the dynamic could be take over what it likely actually is. And I don't mean in just a shipping lens. This isn't me just bashing people that like the two of them romantically. I mean anyone that enjoys coming up with Harbinger dynamics. Child and Scaramouche are co-workers, and that's kind of it. The Harbingers seem to be spread out doing their own individual thing more often than not, and since Child is so new to the position in comparison, I don't know how much time they would have actually had to see each other. Child mentions here that Scaramouche running off with the Gnosis didn't surprise him, but that's more to do with the fact that he views this reaction as something any Harbinger would do, and not necessarily because he has a deeper understanding of Scaramouche's motivations on a more personal level. In fact, Scar seems to know more about Child than Child does about him, which still checks out after 3.3. Albeit more literally. The point is, I don't think their canonical relationship was anything particularly significant. Definitely not more than what any of the other Harbingers have with each other. This setup actually makes potential future interactions between them more likely, because there's no way Scaramouche would be interacting with any current Harbingers if he was still remembered as the Balladeer. And then there's the matter of Dottore, and by now I'm sure you know what I'm going to say. Thankfully, the game is right there alongside me. Scaramouche immediately running off to get his revenge on Dottore would not be conducive to helping him actually grow towards the person he wants to be. And this is what I love about 3.3, and where I think it really shines. It forces Scaramouche to do the one thing he's always struggled to do, which is validate himself. He's repeatedly relied on other people to tell him who he is, but now they quite literally can't. He has to do this entirely by himself, for no one but himself. This is why it fits into his arc so well. Scaramouche now has to come to terms with the fact that how much meaning something has can only ever be determined by the amount we ourselves give to it. Sure, none of these things happened on paper, but they still happened to him, and so by that metric alone, they are important and carry value. Because he still wants to go after Dottore, doesn't he? He's still angry at his mother, isn't he? If the significance of something in your life was only determined by what everyone else thought about it, then those two things would, logically, no longer be true. So, surprise, asshole! You're emotionally affected by things that happened to you. Have fun being the sole bearer of the weight of everything you've ever done for the rest of your life. Do you see how I find it strange to assert that this is him getting off easy? Again, to be clear, I am not saying that this was a good thing for Scar to decide to do it to himself. The game makes sure to establish this as well, which I do really like, especially since this is him definitively choosing to take his own life. They acknowledge all of the ways that this was a poor decision to make without necessarily berating him for having gone through with it. It's a nice thing to see. But now that we've sort of gone through all the events and reasoning that led to this choice, we can finally begin to talk about its most significant consequence.
You'll regret that!
Sure I will.
In the second half of 3.3's quest, we are introduced to this guy. A lone wanderer we find, wandering the streets of Sumeru, with no memory of any of the things we've previously talked about and no knowledge of who he used to be. This random stranger we met on the street iteration of Scaramouche is a really fascinating one, in my opinion, because within the first 20 seconds of him being on screen, we can immediately tell that absolutely nothing has changed. Even without any of his memories, Scaramouche still falls into the exact same patterns he always has. The very first thing we ever see him do is offer his help to a merchant completely free of charge, because he's just so grateful that this man would give an outsider like him the time of day, and he wants to make sure this guy feels properly compensated for the effort he put in to shelter him from that storm. Once he fails at watching the sunsettias, he immediately jumps to another way of making himself useful, and despite apparently only repaying this guy for one instance of him providing him shelter, he doesn't seem inclined to be ending this free labor anytime soon. Look at how completely bewildered he gets by this man telling him to go out and live his life. But I don't, he says, then trails off. You don't what, Scara? Don't have a life outside of the ways you can make yourself useful to people? Once he meets Nahida and starts to learn about his past, look at how he specifically reacts when she's describing this. You drifted from place to place, never able to settle, even when you found status and identity. You adamantly believed that you were missing a heart. This is a feeling he's more than familiar with. He likens himself to a plant with no roots. The merchant found him aimlessly wandering out in a random field somewhere in the middle of a rainstorm. He keeps the fact that he isn't human close to his chest and considers himself to be an outsider. He flat out says this. If given enough time, I could definitely see this guy eventually falling into a trap akin to Shouki no Kami. Maybe not on quite as large of a scale, sure, but we've more than well established by now that this sort of mindset resigns someone to always be looking for bigger and bigger fixes to their problem. And then there's this line, which in itself is an entire demonstration of this pattern at play, especially when you compare it to the second time he chooses to pursue his old memories at the end of the quest. But we'll get to that one in a bit. For now, look at his choice of words here. His memories will be the thing to fill the void within him. He's still willing to pursue anything if he thinks it'll instantly give him what he's been looking for. He wants to find the one thing that will take him across this giant gap he has no idea how to go about breaching on his own. He doesn't go into this with the idea that it will redeem him, nor do I think that it's something he's particularly looking for, so I disagree with the people that try to accuse this moment of doing so. Remember, Scaramouche's actions as the balladeer have not been completely erased or made nil, because he now still has to bear the full brunt of them on his own. If you think that this doesn't count, I will remind you that he, like every other anemo character in this game, is his harshest critic. All of this, his motivations, his decisions, even the way he chooses to carry himself, can always be traced back to one small, simple fact. This far into the video, it's one we're more than familiar with, but it's always worth repeating due to how important and prevalent it is at the center of his entire character arc. Scaramouche hates himself. He always has, which is the reason why he's got a laundry list of masks he's adopted in an effort to avoid ever fully confronting this fact. But that's just it. That's all they are. Masks. There's this one notably loved moment in Undertale, where at the beginning of the game, your character can look into a mirror that will happily tell you it's you. And at the end of the game, if you go back to that same mirror, it will remind you that, despite everything, it's still you. To most people, this sort of sentiment is a comfort. There's a reason it's one of the most beloved quotes of the whole game, despite being such a small moment. To a character like Scaramouche, however, this only serves as a stark, horrifying realization that despite all of your efforts, despite all the pain and time and energy poured into becoming and discarding all these different identities, this entire time you've still only ever just been you. Over and over and over again. And this realization is what takes us to this scene.
That's why... This won't be the end!
This is still my favorite sequence in the entire game, though the one at the end of Fontaine with the ocean is a close second. I might be biased though, because before 3.3 had even come out, I'd written a scene involving Scaramouche that ended up being almost identical to the one we actually got in the game, just with the feather in place of his past self and as a dream sequence. That also makes me feel like I'm qualified to analyze it though, so the idea this cutscene is trying to convey should, at this point, be quite clear. This wanderer version of Scaramouche, already well on his way to falling into the same old patterns he always has, finally sees the cycle for what it is. He is the thing he's been looking for this entire time. Or rather, he can finally start choosing to be. Given that Scar has always relied on predefined roles for himself to fill, I don't think he's ever really sat down and thought about what being himself actually means. He'd likely just immediately written it off as something exceedingly terrible, and wouldn't deign to touch the subject again with a 10-foot pole. Me, myself, but not I. I couldn't have said it better. So this decision, this conviction to finally work through this gap himself and figure out who he is and what he wants to be on his own terms, is what earns him his vision.
You could say his story is simple and straightforward, or horrendously complex, and both would be right. It all depends on the storyteller.
I've already pointed out many of the prevailing similarities between Scaramouche and the other anemo characters, but I wanted to take a larger look at them in one place, as well as delve into his relationship with Electro, because I find it to be a really interesting one. Visions are meant to be given to people that have a certain goal in mind they want to achieve, with the particular way they go about pursuing it indicating whatever element they end up aligning with. Electro characters tend to have goals that are almost entirely external. They're all very comfortable in themselves and who they are, because the things they strive to change and work for involve the attitudes or circumstances of society as a whole. I know a lot of people were really hoping and expecting Scaramouche, once he became playable, to be an Electro unit for obvious reasons, but laid out like this, I find it kind of funny because when you take into account everything I've already talked about, he's kind of the exact opposite. The balladeer, however, is a dead ringer. Self-assuredness, a desire to change society as a whole, finding the problem to be in others rather than with yourself, and confidently sticking to who you are no matter what anyone else says. On paper, he's a clear candidate for Electro. But Scaramouche isn't the balladeer, because the balladeer is a persona. A character he's playing. He doesn't actually exist. And if the main thing you want is to be more like the people around you, that doesn't quite fit in line with striving to change society, does it? So, despite how much he might want to, he still can't embody or resonate with Electro the way he would have needed to. And depending on how you look at it, embodying Electro is sort of the original purpose he was created for that he was unable to fulfill. When you put him right beside all the animal characters, though, it's abundantly clear that he couldn't have ever been anything else. And it isn't just because of the Bohemian Rhapsody references. He shares perspectives and experiences with every single person on this list, so I'll just do a fun little lightning round to illustrate this, while also highlighting some flagship anemo traits. My worth comes solely from my utility. Why am I still here when others deserved it far more? Waiting till one day instantly become the person you want to be rather than having to figure out how to get yourself there, and also being abandoned by the people meant to take care of you. Believing yourself to be so irrevocably terrible that no one could ever genuinely like you as you are. Wanting to find your place in a world you feel you don't belong to. Doing the absolute most at all times to avoid ever truly being perceived by anyone you know. Self-imposed isolation, whether as a conscious form of punishment to yourself or not. The best way to solve a problem is to kill the root before it even starts, which can extend to a number of areas, but most of the time is more socially. I am not who this person or these people believe I am, which for him shows itself through both his insecurities as the Kabuki-mono and the false ego he constructed for himself towards the end of the balladeer into Shouki no Kami, never letting yourself actually reflect and process the things that have happened to you. And, of course, vulnerability bad. There's also the whole dead friend thing, which, yeah, but I think that has more to do with the fact that the anemo element is directly catered to people who have experienced both freedom and the crushing loneliness that can often accompany it. And a quick way to get someone to experience that level of loneliness from just one single instant is grief over someone you really cared about. And, of course, freedom. But the funny thing about anemo is that the thing that makes each of its users free is also the source of most of their strife. They can feel trapped within their own lives because of how free they are, so this freedom they're all associated with is actually something they're all still actively looking for. Issues surrounding identity, isolation, and introspection are the anemo user's perfect trifecta of emotional baggage, and Scaramouche is like the giant poster child of all of these 4 times over. Anemo goals tend to be more abstract, or harder to concretely work toward each day, at least compared to things like I want to be the best blank, or I've dreamt up how I'd like my life to be, and I know the steps I need to take to get me there. If anyone has a full, concrete plan for getting yourself to feel like you're ready to fully face the real world, hit Sayu up, because all she's got so far is growing taller like an adult. And that's it. So Scar's goal here that earns him his vision is simply, well, not simply, because this is a pretty tall order, to figure out who he is at his core. If all this time he's still only ever been himself, then he'll finally stop running from that and make that person he is someone he can actually be proud of, and not throw it away for something shinier the first chance he gets. This scene is so good. It's the first time we actually get to see someone earn their vision in real time, and I think that makes the strength of his conviction here all the more palpable. He again confirms that he is not one to go easy on himself. We get an achievement with my favorite title in the entire game, because yeah, and it's all just a very gratifying, fun time. We then get into the last main section of the quest though, which unfortunately contains the single actual gripe I have with the whole thing. Because, guys, we gotta talk about the naming thing.
Is this some kind of joke?
with all of this time that I've spent talking about how Scaramouche has consistently taken up titles given to him by other people, I'm sure it won't come as a huge surprise that I'm not the biggest fan of the fact that this arc ends with you giving him a name to go by. I can understand their hesitance to give him an actual canonical name so suddenly. It'd be impossible to come up with something the whole player base would be satisfied with, and saying he'll come up with one and tell you later would allow expectations and anticipation to form that would exacerbate this problem even further. So why not just let the player base decide individually for themselves? But you still could have framed this as like giving him a nickname, something only we call him, while he's still taking the time to come up with one himself. It was literally already being set up through Paimon. Here, look how easy this would be.
Why didn't you choose a new name to celebrate?
Oh, come on! You gotta have something! Paimon can't just go around calling you that guy on the street forever!
It's okay if you still need some time to think. Baby birds rarely know how to fly their first time leaving the nest.
Fine! But Paimon still gets to give you a nickname then. What do you think, Traveler?
See? There you go. There's no need to go and inadvertently undermine the literal main point of the story we just spent like 2.5 hours telling. I would even be okay with this if it like carried the tone that the name we give him is still only temporary and he'll use it until he's got more of himself figured out and can then make a definitive decision later, but that doesn't seem to be what they were going for. So it's weird. I get why it was done. Even I couldn't come up with an actual name I felt suited him enough, but it's still just weird. I don't know. It isn't enough to fully sour the rest of the quest for me, obviously, but I do wish they'd have come up with another workaround if they really didn't want to try and directly assign him a new name. Or maybe this was done with the belief that it was a satisfying way to conclude the story, in which case I disagree. Naming aside, I do like how this section shows that progress is not necessarily linear, and how he's still got aspects of his unhealthier mindsets remaining that Nahida can now work to counteract. He talks about chasing after Dottore, and they're like, whoa, let's maybe not do that, buddy. And that's yet another reason I actually love the Irminsul decision. It's now forced Scaramouche to really sit with and deliberate on and process everything surrounding Dottore, because it's now abundantly clear that doing so really would not end up getting anywhere at all. And like, it was never going to do that, but now the guy doesn't even remember any of it. Even Scara himself can't ignore the fact that pursuing him is ultimately pointless. And that's it for 3.3. What a really, really great quest. I think I've made my general thoughts more than abundantly clear at this point, so I won't harp on them any longer.
We're done here. Next time you're looking for directions, I suggest you find your own way.
Scaramouche is an incredibly unique and interesting character, both among the game's roster and just in general, and I don't know if Genshin will ever really create someone like him again. The nature of his story combined with the slow build-up and fulfillment of his arc is something likely hard to replicate, with just how early on he'd been placed into the game. Though I will never complain about more introspective, character-driven arcs, and have been absolutely thrilled at the lean towards these we've seen in Fontaine. He is the blueprint. Thank you. It was great to see him in the introduction competition event, even if he didn't have a super big role, and it's great to see that he's still staying with Nahida. I don't think we'll ever get something as big as 3.3 again, but the game has gotten leagues better at incorporating emotional moments and interactions between the characters we actually care about into their limited events, so I'm optimistic that we'll still be treated to more in terms of on-screen development. Scaramouche is one of very few characters to actually have his entire emotional arc be fully portrayed on screen, though, which I think has contributed to what makes him so interesting and appealing to look at. Because of the nature of how visions are given, most characters we meet have already experienced some form of their own emotional climax, because they've all already become Allegenes. And not that there aren't any other avenues for development, of course. But Scaramouche is one of the only instances in this game where we've actually gotten to physically see and experience all of this lead up and development firsthand. This, along with the general themes and ideas communicated through his story, have all contributed towards making him an incredibly complex, interesting, and sympathetic character, and an indisputable top favorite for me. Thank you so much for watching if you've watched this far. I've never made anything like this, but I love analysis, and Scaramouche just kind of demands it. So if you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like or a comment telling me your thoughts. I would love to discuss different things with you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you whenever. Bye! Inversion of Genesis. Full Metal Alchemist. Inversion of Genesis. And I can't say it seriously now that I said that.
Paimon can just go around calling you that guy on the street forever.
I can't.